Dozens killed and injured. Massive Russian air raid shreds neighborhoods across Kyiv. What signals is Putin sending to Trump and the world by launching a large-scale shelling of Kyiv? And how should Trump ultimately respond to all these killings? These and other topics we will discuss right now. My name is Iryna Uzlova, and today with us is Uriel Epstein, Chief Executive Officer of Renew Democracy Initiative. Uriel, hello, glad to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
James Waterhouse, BBC Kyiv correspondent, reported that Ukrainians have long suffered from deadly drone and missile strikes from Russia, but last night's attack was, in the words of one official, special. It was the first time Kyiv had been hit significantly since Donald Trump hosted Vladimir Putin in Alaska 10 days ago. Trump greeted the Russian leader with applause and later claiming that Putin wants to make a deal for me. The current strikes give credence to Europe's argument that the Kremlin has no interest in peace. Europe will continue to urge Trump to get tougher on Moscow. Trump has so far resisted new sanctions, although he has agreed to impose higher tariffs on India, a major buyer of Russian oil. He has often expressed frustration with Russian airstrikes, but that has not been enough to stop the strikes on Ukrainian city. Russia's massive attacks on Ukraine threaten the peace that U.S. President Donald Trump seeks, stated U.S. Special Envoy for Ukraine Kellogg today. Kellogg noted that Russia carried out the second largest airstrike since the start of the full-scale war, using 600 drones and 31 missiles. The targets, not soldiers and weapons, but residential areas in Kyiv, blasting civilian trains, the European Union and British mission council offices, and innocent civilians. These attacks threaten the peace that President Trump is pursuing, Kellogg said. So, Uriel, can we say that really Trump's shuttle diplomacy is failing miserably?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no surprise here. I mean, this is exactly what most of us predicted. You know, you mentioned that Trump being frustrated with these attacks was insufficient for Putin to stop them. I mean, I think that's an almost laughable sentence, right? The very idea that the simple fact that Trump is frustrated with Putin would be enough to stop him. I mean, Putin doesn't care if Trump is frustrated. Putin doesn't care if any American president is frustrated. The only thing Putin understands is strength. That's it. You know, this concept of peace through strength is actually a valid one. Unfortunately, what I think we've seen from the American administration is that despite all these words to the contrary, right, all the times that they've talked about peace through strength, what we're seeing on the ground is that it's the exact opposite, right? It's essentially violence as a result of weakness. And that, I think, is what Putin is messaging to the world, right? Again, I don't think Putin actually cares all that much about Donald Trump. I mean, you mentioned this is the first big strike since the talks. I mean, the talks were 10 days ago. That's not a long time. And so in just 10 short days, Putin has launched one of the most aggressive attacks on the Ukrainian capital, killing at this point, I believe it's at least 18 civilians, and injuring, of course, countless more. This is something that cannot be lost on the free world, right? I mean, at this point, truthfully, I don't think that Donald Trump is going to react, right? I mean, best case scenario, perhaps his wife, Melania Trump, will see this and you know, she will try to influence her husband to be stronger, to be more assertive, and to actually do the things that are necessary in order for Ukraine, at the very least, to be able to protect its own civilians. And this is the last point, and the most important point to be made, is that Donald Trump's actions do not only limit Ukraine's ability to strike Russia, to push back on Russia, to regain some of the territory and therefore the lives of people living on that land that Russia has conquered. Instead, his actions limit Ukrainian abilities to defend their own civilians. So it's not just about being able to push back on the Russians and wage war more effectively. It is also about literally just protecting their own cities, protecting their own people, and Trump's unwillingness to either recognize the necessity for Ukraine to do this and to enable them to do so, I think is actually going to be a significant impediment to the very peace that he claims he wants to see.
Diane Francis, editor of Canada's National Post, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, reported that Trump's shuttle diplomacy, his rhetoric, his fuss and his dramatic efforts to organize summits have so far produced no results. Putin continues his war despite the feverish peace efforts of President Trump and European leaders. The alliance, NATO, is dealing with an unstoppable killer, but it is behaving like the police trying to reason with a man wearing a suicide vest, armed to the teeth, and with a criminal record a mile long. Someone who can only be stopped by force. And really, Uriel, you mentioned about weapon, about our protection. This scenario is very easy, but so hard to Trump. Give us or sell us and European partners more weapon and impose sanctions against Russia. Two tools, and that's all, and it will be effective. So why does Trump can do it right now, or maybe tomorrow, or maybe yesterday?
Look, I don't know what is in Donald Trump's heart. I don't know what he believes. I don't know what he feels, and I may have my suspicions. But the answering your question of why is very difficult because there could be any number of answers, and I'm not sure it's the right question, right? Because again, there could be any number of reasons. It could be that he genuinely admires Putin because he has the dictatorial strength that perhaps Trump himself wishes he could have in democratic America, in an open society. So that could be one. I mean, there could be any number of other reasons. But the real question that we should be asking ourselves is not why is Trump doing this? It's what can we do or what can be done in order to move the American president and move the American administration into a more productive direction? And first and foremost, I think it comes down to the empowerment of Congress. In the United States Senate, you have 83 senators who support secondary sanctions and more aggressive direct sanctions on Russia. That kind of bipartisanship is unheard of, right? It's unprecedented right now in today's America. And yet it exists on this issue. And despite that bipartisanship, this bill to get those sanctions across the finish line has been blocked by the White House. And so I can only wish that U.S. senators, that some of the most powerful men and women in America would decide to take back the prerogative and assert the congressional right to actually put out legislation that is in American interests. So that's number one. It's we must see leadership from Congress as a result of what can only be seen as a failure of this shuttle diplomacy. This can only be perceived as Russia's complete unwillingness to move even 1 inch, 1 centimeter away from their goals. And in fact, what's so surprising to me is how willing Putin is to insult Trump, to ignore him, to offend him. I mean, again, the fact that this attack happened just 10 days after the talks, the fact that shortly after Donald Trump's election, right, going way back, right, shortly after Donald Trump's election, Russian state media was showing naked photos of his wife, Melania Trump, on national television. All of this indicates that Putin isn't even willing to give Trump a little bit so that Trump can point to it and say that he succeeded and be able to announce some form of victory. And I can only hope that Vladimir Putin has finally overreached right? That he has finally gone a step too far and he has alienated the Trump administration to the point that they might finally be willing to recognize that the original way that they saw this conflict, right, of Russia being open and willing to make a deal, and that it's Ukraine and Zelensky that was intransigent, that original framing is wrong, and that in fact Ukraine has been willing now for months to adopt a ceasefire, which was Trump's original demand. And it is Russia, in fact, that is dragging its heels. And with each and every conversation, with each and every meeting, Russia isn't just sort of not reacting, right? It's not just not doing anything new. It's actually acting even worse. It is becoming more aggressive. It's killing more people. It's launching more missiles and drones. And so, you know, what we must conclude is that these conversations do not lead us closer to peace. And instead, they empower Russia to be ever more aggressive and to kill ever more people. Meanwhile, the only times that we have seen Russia pull back, that we have seen Putin hesitate, is when the free world demonstrates its unity and its strength, and when Ukraine is able to develop victories, to achieve victories on the battlefield. These are the only things that Putin understands, and I believe that these are the only things that could ultimately move the needle in this conflict.
Well, because Putin feels impunity. Yes, I quite right understand all this. And he get some benefits after Alaska, and he, Putin, Russian dictator, understands that he can attack European Union buildings. He can attack American plant in Mukachewa last week, and nothing after it, only good or neutral things for him.
Well, that's a really important point, right? Like Trump's core argument here is that American investment in Ukraine is a de facto security guarantee because Russia would never dare attack an American company. It would never dare attack American property. And yet just a few days ago, we saw Russia do exactly that, and we saw nothing coming out of the White House. And that's what's shocking to me, is that if Trump really wanted to advance the very thing that he's promoting, right? This very concept of peace through strength, very concept of implicit security guarantees as a result of direct American investment, then it is in his personal interest to react very strongly to Russia's willingness to strike an American target in Ukraine. And so the fact that the White House hasn't commented on it is baffling to me.
Talking about security guarantees, it's very interesting and unusual question without a lot of answers. How do you think, Uriel, can these security guarantees be real, reliable for a long time for future? And what kind of participating we can see from the United States, from European Union?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. We just put out a piece recently. So one of the things my organization does, the Renewed Democracy Initiative, is we put out a publication called The Next Move. And so, one of our key individuals is Gary Kasparov. And in this publication, we talk, unsurprisingly, about the next move, right? Like the point is to look at our strategy moving forward. And one of the key questions that we have as it relates to the Ukrainian conflict is what do these security guarantees actually look like? So when European countries and even the US come out and say that there would be an offer of quote unquote NATO-like security guarantees for Ukraine, what does that mean? And the answer is we don't know. And that's a massive problem. Because right now, security guarantees, I would joke in English, they're like Schrodinger's security guarantees. They simultaneously exist and they don't exist because we can't describe them in any real detail.
And sorry for a minute, no one even has ever checked if NATO Article 5 really works, for example, even like this.
That's right. There was only one time in history, right? I'll remind viewers, only one time in history that Article 5 has ever been invoked. And that was as a result of September 11th. When America was attacked, we invoked Article 5 and NATO allies came to our aid, right? That's what's so incredible. Meanwhile, Donald Trump in his first term said openly that he might not respect Article 5 and that he may not come to the aid of another country that's attacked. And so, to your point, yes, Article 5 has never been tested. And what I fear most is that Ukraine is a country of 45 million people. It is considered the breadbasket of Europe, right? It's a key food exporter. And if the free world is unable or unwilling to defend Ukraine, then if I'm Putin, right, if I'm going to put on my dictator hat for a second, it would not be illogical for me to conclude that if we are unwilling to defend Ukraine, we might also be unwilling to defend small countries like Lithuania or Estonia, who are members of NATO. So if Putin is allowed to claim any sort of victory in Ukraine, what would stop him from not only continuing this war in Ukraine in a few years, but perhaps most dangerously of all, from attacking Lithuania, right? A country of just around 2 million people. And if he were to attack Lithuania, then we would be faced with a very stark choice. Either we honor Article 5, in which case then we have a direct war between the United States and Russia, the exact thing that Trump has been saying he wants to avoid. Or Article 5 is no longer worth the paper that it's written on, in which case the NATO alliance essentially falls apart and we enter a world that looks a lot more like the world of the early 20th century, where countries have spheres of influence and where you have far less stability, where you have more conflict, and most dangerously of all, you have more great power conflict between countries that have nuclear weapons. And that's the thing that scares me the most. So going back to your point, your question about security guarantees for Ukraine, I would say first and foremost that we have no idea. Right now, nobody has any idea what those security guarantees will look like. But I will make what I think is sort of the key criteria for those security guarantees, whatever they are, is that they have to be credible and they have to include direct military involvement of Western allied nations, because anything short of that invites further aggression from Russia. Because again, I mean, as I don't have to remind Ukrainians that in 1994 there were security guarantees, right? There were promises.
Budapest memorandum. It was very strong, but for only for a moment of its signing, and that's all. And then all participants of these security guarantees ruined it: Russia, Chinese, and all participants.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. was a participant, right? We signed the memorandum in '94. Ukraine said no to what I think was the third biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons at that time in the world. You know, just think, going back for one moment, would any of this be happening if you guys had nuclear weapons?
Yes. I think that Putin wouldn't attack us at all, because he's afraid of nuclear weapon and nuclear equipment and strong.
So again, in the spirit of the next move, right? In the spirit of our publication, like, we need to play this out a few moves ahead. What kind of incentive structure are we building for people or for countries around the world if we do not offer Ukraine ironclad security guarantees? Then other countries are first and foremost incentivized to develop nuclear weapons. Number two, Putin is potentially incentivized to directly threaten NATO nations, because from his point of view, if we are not willing to defend Ukraine, maybe we're not willing to defend Lithuania or Estonia, which from a strategic point of view are, quite frankly, they're just much smaller, right? Like, they're much smaller nations and they have much less impact globally speaking. So, you know, perhaps we're not willing to defend them, and that would lead to the dissolution of NATO. And last but not least, it would kind of call into question a lot of global treaties. It would, I think, grind a lot of this sort of global trade and prosperity that we have enjoyed since the end of World War II. A lot of that would grind to a halt, because countries wouldn't be able to trust one another. And, we would enter a world where might would make right.
Yes, and one detail that since the beginning of August, we are striking the Russian oil refining sector and are not afraid of anything, although Russia is a nuclear power. So why our allies are so afraid to give us, for example, boots on the ground? And like a piece of such security guarantees, we can strike and attack Russian Federation, and we are not afraid, but our allies are afraid.
Well, actually, I think that's a really important point, because the messaging that the free world is sending to Putin is that if he rattles the proverbial nuclear saber, we will back off. And that is really dangerous messaging for us to send, especially because the messaging we've gotten in return from Russia is actually that much of what Putin says is a bluff, right? Going back to the Biden administration, originally we were only going to provide Ukraine, quote unquote, defensive weapons, right? Because anything else would provoke Russia. And then, of course, we started providing offensive weapons, and guess what? Nothing happened. Right. Then, we couldn't provide you HIMARS, right? The long range multi-targeting missile system, and, because that would be perceived as too aggressive by Russia. What happened? Nothing, right? Putin did not respond when we ultimately gave you that. We couldn't give you tanks because Putin would respond. We gave you tanks, nothing happened. We couldn't give you F-16s because Putin would respond. We gave you F-16s, nothing happened. Putin kept saying that the whole reason for this war is NATO expansion. And then as a direct result of the war, NATO expanded, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO and thereby doubling NATO's border with Russia. And how did Russia respond? What did Putin say? It's not my concern. Right? Nothing. There was no response. So what we can conclude from this is that, one, these threats coming from Putin are bluffs intended to deter the free world from protecting other free nations. And number two, by falling for it, right, by giving into those bluffs, we are actually encouraging bad actors. We are encouraging dictators to be more aggressive, because they know that if they're more aggressive, then we will back off. We won't react. So it is inviting greater violence. And so for all these people who might call organizations such as ours warmongers, etc., I would argue the exact opposite. That what we are proposing and what we are advocating is the exact thing that would prevent war in the long term.
And really, how effective are our Ukrainian drone strikes against Russian oil refineries inside Russia also?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, right? Like, you have destroyed, I think the last estimate I saw, and it might be even more because this was a few days ago, I think roughly 13% of Russian oil generating capacity.
21%, Uriel, today, at 21% today, we have such number, really.
So that's right. So my number was outdated. 21% of Russia's oil producing capacity destroyed. And yet again, what does Russia do in response? The only thing it can do, which is kill more Ukrainian civilians. That's it. That is the only tool left in Russia's arsenal that they can realistically deploy, is murdering more civilians, while Ukraine, of course, does not target civilians, but rather targets the infrastructure that enables Russia to continue this war. And I would go one step further, and I would recall Operation Spiderweb and the destruction of some percentage of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. Again, this was an incredible achievement, and yet Russia was unable to effectively respond. So it is truly shocking to me that for once we have an ally in the form of Ukraine that is not only able and willing to defend itself, but it's able to do so to such a successful extent that it beats all Western intelligence estimates and expectations. And yet, despite this fact, we are still unwilling for whatever reason, to give you the materiel, to give you the military supplies and arms and ammunition that you need to actually bring this war to an end. And the very last thing I'll say on this point is that you mentioned boots on the ground. Boots on the ground from the West are only necessary once this war is over, right? To ensure a durable peace, to ensure that Russia does not again try to invade its neighbors. In the meantime, what is necessary is not for the US to send soldiers to Ukraine or for Europe to send soldiers to Ukraine. What is necessary is for Europe and the United States and other free nations to commit weapons, to commit weaponry to Ukraine's cause, to ensure that Ukraine has the means to defend itself. And again, for all of those sort of, I would say, radical, extremists, and many of them pro-Russian, who say that this position will lead to American troops on the ground. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. It's the exact opposite. If we want to ensure that American blood will not be spilt in Europe, and that European blood outside of Ukraine will not be spilt as a result of Russian aggression, then the only way to guarantee it is to give Ukraine the means to push the Russians back and ensure that Ukraine's sovereignty is guaranteed and defended over the long term.
Uriel, but I saw one plus from Trump's policy and even a fulfilled promise by Donald Trump. It's tariffs against India. The US has imposed a massive 50% tariff on Indian imports, citing India's continued purchase of discounted Russian oil, a move projected to reduce Indian exports to the US significantly and potentially dent India's GDP by around 1%. So, Uriel, with this case, do you think this pressure is enough to sway India's policy, and should we expect similar measures or near something like this targeting China soon?
So, that's a really important point. And you have to give credit where credit is due, right? Like the tariffs on India as a result of them purchasing cheap Russian oil are exactly appropriate, and they are the right thing to do. The problem is that Donald Trump sees tariffs as the solution to everything, right? But tariffs become a lot less effective if they are levied against everyone, right? I mean, there are tariffs right now against Ukraine, right? There are tariffs against European nations, against everyone. And quite frankly, there's very little correlation between how high those tariffs are and whether a country is an ally or an enemy of the United States. And so that's one of the reasons that's one of the things that I think is actually weakening the impact of these tariffs on India. In other words, if we leverage tariffs less often, right? If we only use them against true foes, or if we use them as a scalpel, as a very pointed, specific tool to pressure countries to engage in behavior that is in our interests, then I think they would be a lot more effective. So if we did not have sanctions of 25%, for instance, against pretty much everyone, then these tariffs against India would have a much greater impact. And one of the concerns I have moving forward is that because we have put tariffs on much of the world, there is absolutely a scenario in which all of these countries end up collaborating more with one another, right? So because we have tariffed Europe, I would not be surprised if we suddenly saw Europe trade more with India, thereby diminishing, right, limiting the impact of American tariffs on both India and Europe. So in short, are these tariffs having an impact on India? Yes. Will that impact lead India to change course, for instance, and to stop buying Russian oil? I doubt it.
And what about China? Do you think that it can be possible Trump can strike China by big tariffs? Because we see such situation this spring, but then after a few weeks, Trump declined all his decision about big tariffs against China. But some of Ukrainian experts think that war between the US and China can be possible, and not only trade war, but real even.
I don't think. I mean, do I think China will be more aggressive over the
Yeah.
course of the next 2 to 4 years? Yes. I think there's at least a 50% chance that during Trump's term, China may try to take Taiwan. While we are distracted, while we are being isolationist, while we are diminishing our power internationally, China would absolutely, they'd be foolish not to take advantage of that. So I think there's a real chance that China does that, especially when our commitments to Taiwan are in question at the moment, right? I think that the previous administration was fairly clear that they would militarily come to the aid of Taiwan in case of an invasion. I think the Trump administration has been notably less clear in that regard. And I hope that that changes, right? I mean, I hope that Donald Trump issues a statement saying that, if God forbid China were to invade, that of course we would come to the aid of Taiwan. So in the case of kinetic war, unfortunately, I think the risk is there, but I actually don't think the United States would step up. Now, in case of a trade war, again, if we were not putting tariffs on everyone else, then I would say, sure. I mean, then there would be an opportunity to unite with kind of all these other countries in the free world in order to put pressure on China. But when we have already put tariffs on everyone else, our ability to also put tariffs on China is going to be limited because at a certain point, the cost of all of those tariffs will be too high for us, right? I mean, I look at things in supermarket and other places. I mean, prices are going up. I see it when I look at Amazon and I think about the things that I want to buy for myself. I mean, you see these price increases, and at a certain point, the American people are going to say that it's too much. And so I believe that that is the thing that is going to limit Trump's ability to actually put punishing sanctions on China is the very fact that we have sanctions on everyone else. That's actually, I should say, that's the first thing that will limit his ability to do that. The second thing is that we don't actually have the capacity to produce a lot of the things domestically that are currently being produced in China. A great example of that is the iPhone. The iPhone requires a very specialized set of skills and engineering and so forth in order to produce. And I saw a study at one point that indicated that Apple spent, I think, over $50 billion or something like that developing that skill set in China. And so this is something, unfortunately, we should have been thinking about decades ago, and we didn't, right? This is where actually I think there is truth to the idea that there's such a thing as too much globalism, right? I mean, I think we should be honest with ourselves and careful about how much capacity we allow our foes to have, whereby we don't have that capacity. And so right now, I think that's another limiting factor that Donald Trump is going to run into. It's that the things that we have come to expect, like iPhones and other electronics, we just don't have the skill set. We don't have the workforce in America to produce a lot of that domestically. And, perhaps this is a wake-up call and we will start training that workforce. But I think we should be under no illusions that this will not happen overnight. It will take 2, 3, 4, 5 years before we make serious progress towards being able to actually develop some of these supply chains domestically.
Yes, it's a problem. It's wrought with both sides and problem with a lot of questions too. Uriel, thank you for your answers to my question, for your professional and clear opinion and thoughts. I hope see you next week. Take care.
Thank you so much. Great to be on.
Uriel Epstein, Chief Executive Officer of Renew Democracy Initiative. My name is Iryna Uzlova. Guys, thank you for joining us, for watching. Leave your comments, please, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, War and Politics 24. See you later. Bye.